Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg, Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. I would like to begin by thanking Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Agnes Sue Tang, Chair of the Board of Trustees, and all of our trustees, and particularly the champions of our library, the late Patricia D. Klingenstein, Sue Ann Weinberg, and Sidney Lapidus. We also acknowledge the generosity of the Mellon Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, Helen and the late Robert Appel, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. The Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at New York Historical is one of the oldest, most distinguished research libraries in the United States. It holds millions of books, newspapers, maps, manuscripts, prints, photographs, and architectural collections. It is a vital center of research into the history of New York and the nation. Key to that research is the presence of a yearly rotation of scholarly fellows, both in residence and in a short-term capacity. Our fellows are engaged in advancing knowledge as they mine New York Historical's collections for new ways of interpreting the American past. We are most fortunate to have them in our midst. Tonight's program will give you just a taste of the quality of work that is being done. Council Fire School Indigenous Knowledge and Settler Education in early New York will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. This evening's presentation will feature the work of Jeffers Lennox, 2023-24 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the New York Historical Society. Dr. Lennox is an associate professor of history at Wesleyan University, studying the history of early North America from the 17th to early 19th centuries, with specific interest in the British, French, and Indigenous relations in northeastern North America, and the impact that Canada had on the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. His first book, Homelands and Empires, Indigenous Spaces, Imperial Fictions, and Competition for Territory in Northeastern North America, 1690 to 1763, won numerous awards, including the Clio Award for Atlantic History and Best Book in Canadian History from the Canadian Historical Association, and the John Lyman Book Award, Canadian Maritime History from the North American Society for Oceanic History. His most recent book, North of America, Loyalists, Indigenous Nations, and the Borders of the Long American Revolution, was published by Yale University Press in 2022. He received a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Toronto and a Master of Arts and PhD from Dalhousie University. In conversation with Jeffers this evening is Irene Norman, Supervisor of Curriculum and Instruction at the Institute for American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. Welcome, Jeffers and Irene.
Thank you so much, Valerie, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd like to begin just very briefly by thanking not only Valerie, but Kiona and Jessica, who have helped organize this webinar, the reference librarians that I've been so fortunate to work with at the library, Crystal, Jill, Grace, and Gina, and everybody there who's made my time at the New York Historical Society so enjoyable. What Irene and I will be talking about is just a little section of what I have been working on at the society. And I came in here with an idea of a big project, and what I was hoping for was I would find something small to play with. And I think I have found something that I found quite interesting. I was able to look at almost everything at the Historical Society dealing with Indigenous relations in early New York, and it's way too much to even mention at this talk. But what Irene and I are going to be chatting about is a document that I found in a bound collection of about 200 pages, which deals with Indigenous settler relations, particularly councils and council fires. So these are moments when where usually settler officials and leading Indigenous figures would sit down and try to hash out either differences or negotiate alliances or simply form kinship bonds in ways that would allow these groups to interact ideally peacefully. And the document that I'm looking at is a 10-day conference that took place in the fall of 1800 on the Bay of Quinte. And if you want to just quickly show that first slide, that would be great. And the Bay of Quinte is close to what is now Kingston, Ontario. That's not New York, you might be saying. You're absolutely right. But this is a region from to which many Haudenosaunee or Iroquois members fled after the American Revolution. So the revolution sort of forced a split amongst the Haudenosaunee, and with the American victory, so many of the Haudenosaunee were allied with the British that they lost land, and they were forced or invited to relocate to other places. One group went to the Grand River, which is sort of close to Hamilton, Ontario, and the other settled at the Bay of Quinte, which is on the eastern edge of Lake Ontario. So if I were to quickly summarize this document, the settlement at the Bay of Quinte, which started in 1783-84, ended up suffering some internal friction. There were two factions that settled in the region. There was Chief John, who's better known as Deseronton, and another Chief Isaac Hill. Chief John was appointed the chief of the village, but Chief Isaac and his followers had relocated from Grand River to the Bay of Quinte. And through a series of interpersonal conflicts and sort of power struggles, there was a violent encounter leading to the murder of two men, a man named Lawrence and his son. And this council meeting is a record of two sides of this story trying to make known what happened and get to the bottom of it, and ideally to find a way to reconcile and bring peace back to the village. So a representative from the settler government came. He was the superintendent, I think the deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs, with the specific goal of figuring out what had happened and how to make it right. It's a rather complicated story, and the document is fascinating because it reads almost like a movie script. You get one side of the story and another side of the story. You have to figure out what you think actually happened. And I asked Irene to just read it with me so that we could talk about it. And Irene, I'm really curious, sort of what you got out of this document and any of the things that stood out to you.
Um, well, just generally speaking, before we get into specific themes, it really had a very Rashomon style of doing things. You know, you got everyone's different perspective. But I also appreciated that it um also looked a lot like a court document from, you know, from a criminal case. And that, you know, the superintendent was acting as the judge, and the interpreters were almost acting as the attorneys in this case, because, you know, you're not actually you know, getting the direct words, you're just getting the interpreter's words of it. But you even saw parts where they were bringing in witnesses, which I thought, you know, so I was thinking, okay, it's very interesting that that's how this is functioning in this case. So that's one of the things that stuck out to me as I read. Another thing was also, since you're getting the different perspectives, if those of you, if you get a chance to read this, when they have Chief John talking, he is just talking so much smack about Chief Isaac the whole time, and it's kind of hilarious. He's like, oh, he never shows up to councils and he never even does anything. So, you know, I just thought it's a serious subject, but the way that he's talking was just kind of hilarious to me, because like I've definitely known elders who act the way that he was.
Yes, absolutely. And this is, I mean, I really did enjoy that element of reading the account. And in part, when I get my students to read these kinds of documents, I try to make it clear to them um, how much theater is not necessarily the wrong word, but humor is really important. ways of describing stories that you really do get this sense of storytelling is key to what is happening. And I do think that all comes out. And so what I think Irene and I would like to try to work our way through, we may not have time to get all to everything, but there's sort of three themes that stuck out to both of us, that we think help demonstrate um, what the deputy superintendent was learning from this council fire, but also what we can learn today from the way that Indigenous nations operated in the 17th and 18th centuries. Because it's not, it isn't the same as understanding sort of English or French law. There's different purposes for these meetings. The outcomes are meant to resolve problems differently. And so there's three themes. The first is sort of the importance of land. The second is the role of gender and race, and the third is this notion of diplomacy. So for the first theme, there is this difficult decision that the Haudenosaunee, particularly the Mohawk, have to make to leave their homelands in what is now upstate New York, and relocate to territories that they had connections to, but were not sort of central to their homelands. The Grand River was a traditional hunting territory for the Haudenosaunee. I think they have less of a connection to the Bay of Quinte, which was Mississauga land. But it does, this relocation opens up opportunities for conflict, and I think some of that comes out not only in the document itself, but also in the history of the relationship of sort of Indigenous identity to land. Would you agree with that, Irene?
Yeah, and I mean, especially if we're talking about the Mohawk. So Mohawk is an exonym, a name given by other groups to them. And I'm actually a Mohawk descendant, and what we call ourselves is Gani and Gehaga, which means people of the Flint Stone place, because that's what you found along the Mohawk River. Um, and so, moving away from that place, that really affects yourself because you're away from what helped make you who you were. And the trauma of that is also going to make you more likely to have conflicts with other people, and it's going to pass through the generations.
Certainly. Yeah, and I think that point about the double name is really important, because one of the things that I've learned and I try to impart on my students is that most Indigenous nations have two names.
Mhm.
The name that they give themselves is usually something like the people of the place and a way of describing the place. And the themes that I found for the names that are given to the nations, they're often either by their enemies or by foreign Indigenous nations. So they tend to be names like people who talk funny, or people who don't sound like us, or people who are violent. And so it really does sort of depend on which settler picked up which version of the name and started writing it down the most. And the challenge is to get students and scholars to refer to groups by the names that they called themselves. So I think that's a really important point. Um, Now, this decision to settle where they did settle was something of a discussion amongst the Haudenosaunee. Chief John Deseronton did not want to settle near Niagara. And this is, the Grand River starts just west of Niagara Falls. And his reasoning was that it was too close to the Americans. So right after the American Revolution, he was worried about proximity. And he writes, the Americans are like a worm that cuts off the corn as soon as it appears. So he's able to describe his feelings towards the Americans and his reason for wanting to settle somewhere else. But not everyone agreed with it, right, Irene?
Yeah, one of the things I thought interesting when I did a little bit additional research was the group that went to Grand River with Joseph Brant. They supposedly said that they thought the Bay of Quinte was exposed to such retaliation as revenge might urge the Americans to attempt. So they thought that that was the more dangerous place to be. And they kind of made fun of Chief John for sticking with it when they could have gone to Grand River instead.
Absolutely. Yes. And this is, at this time, there is a real concern for not only the Haudenosaunee, but also for white loyalists who were fleeing during and after the American Revolution. And the resettlement at the Bay of Quinte is complicated in part because it is accompanied by a massive resettlement of white loyalists, um, also of free blacks and of enslaved blacks who white loyalists were allowed to bring with them. So there is, over the course of the 1780s, a massive influx. And part of the challenge at the Bay of Quinte is that the Haudenosaunee have to integrate not only with the Mississauga, another indigenous nation whose homelands they were going to share, but also with this massive influx of white settlers. And as a result, there is sort of a lot of cultural learning that has to take place. And white settlers are not always great at that. Some truly do attempt to understand and even integrate with the Haudenosaunee, but others see these groups as a possible threat, and don't necessarily understand the relationship to the land and the relationship to sort of a sense of kinship among not just people, but also among both the living and a non-living world. Was there anything you
Um,
wanted to add with that, Irene?
yeah, I mean, and you can see it in the document in some places where they talk about, I'm going to missay his name, but the Muska, the Swedish immigrant, where basically where
Yes. Yeah.
Keith is saying, we had asked the colonial governor to make sure that white people could not move in this area, and he said he would, but he didn't. And now there are at least three people they call out specifically who they say were egging this whole thing on, and the Swedish immigrant, like, uh, getting in someone else's hunting area made it worse. So you can see how that misunderstanding culturally exacerbated situations.
Certainly. Yes. No, that's a great point. Um, so if we think about what happens, the murder that takes place and the subsequent council, um, another important theme that jumped out to me was the role of both gender and race. I think there are two really important elements that take place in this story. Um, the first is that women were participants, and this would possibly be surprising for settlers at the time. It certainly wouldn't have been surprising for indigenous nations who had a different idea of gender. Um, and part of the split in the factions was, in fact, the result of a woman pushing to have Chief John ousted and replaced. And this is, again, not uncommon and is, in fact, a practice among the Haudenosaunee. Women were rarely the political leaders themselves, but they often selected suitable candidates for those leadership positions.
Yeah, clan mothers, if you look at it, look at the way Haudenosaunee government is put forth, it's similar to the U.S. in that, there's the three branches, and the clan mothers would be sort of like the judicial branch where they can overturn things. And I thought it was interesting that you do see some women, but you don't see them in a formal sense working in this, which, like with formal political influence and formally create or putting someone in a leadership position or taking them out of it. So it seemed like maybe they were already being influenced by European standards when it comes to that.
Certainly. Yeah. And I also think it's in these documents and in older documents, one of the challenges of sort of settler learning is they don't even think to look to women as possible leaders. They don't even, it doesn't enter their mind necessarily that when they're at a meeting, that the women there are important participants. And another document that I really enjoyed reading at the Historical Society was a diary of a woman named Anne Powell, who was the daughter of a Boston loyalist. Oh, and Jeff, maybe you could pull up slide 3, please, just as for a visual on this, or just to accompany. So she's the daughter of a loyalist, and she took a trip from Montreal to Detroit. And so just as an example, this is a completely different council, but you can hopefully you can see in the back, there's a group of women sitting there, both attending, and it looks like because of their positioning, are potentially participating in this larger council that's taking place. Anyway, this woman, Ann Powell, she leaves a diary of her trip from Montreal to Detroit in 1785. So this is right around the time of the Haudenosaunee relocation. And she does witness an Indigenous council. And she uses terribly offensive language to describe the Indigenous women that she sees. But what she doesn't realize is that these older women were likely participants in the proceedings. And she wonders why it is that there are a bunch of old women sitting around as this is happening. Later on in this diary, she sees another council, and this time she refers to a respectable band of matrons. So her thinking has changed a little bit. So here's some evidence of education. But she also talks about, it makes her think about settler society, white society, because she notes that in her society, when a man and women get old, they tend to become less useful. But then she writes in her account, on the banks of Lake Erie, a woman becomes respectable as she grows old. And I suppose the greatest compliment you can pay a young Indian hero is to say he is as wise as an old woman. So I think, I mean, Irene's description of how women function in these societies is so important, and it's left out both because settlers could not even consider it as an option, but also because it often took place beyond the view of settlers. This was happening daily in Indigenous societies.
I'm
And
just wondering
yeah,
if you think that in the case of this document, if it's a matter of the people who were recording things not thinking that the input of the women was important enough to record, or if it was a matter of them not being or not having input in this situation. Do you see any indications to indicate one way or another in your experience?
yeah, I think the date of this council, 1800, by then I think the British understood
Mhm.
that women played a leading role. There's lots of evidence from the Revolutionary era of councils where the settler administrators are less confused as to why there's both women and often children taking part in these councils. The children were really important, obviously, because when the day is done, they hear the story of what has happened and can then, serve as the historical archive in an oral history tradition. So I do think that and this is one of the reasons I'm fascinated by the Bay of Quinte is because it's a new place. It is much more influenced by settler society. These are primarily converted and Christianized indigenous peoples who have taken on um, a lot of the sort of gender baggage of the settler societies that they have grown to understand. So I think I do think they are both leaving it out intentionally, but also are perhaps not getting the full story because they're not present at the conversations that are happening.
That makes sense to me.
And very quickly before we get on to the last section, is one fascinating element of this council is that it does indicate that the Haudenosaunee at the Bay of Quinte held African slaves, and not only that, but those slaves are given a voice. So there is a reference. Chief Isaac has what is termed a Negro boy. And that boy is in fact interviewed at council and is speaking on behalf of what had happened. And then there is an adult um, African enslaved man who is described as living amongst the Haudenosaunee at the Bay of Quinte. And so I think this is important because it does a couple of things. One, it continues to put the lie to the fact that there were no slaves in Canada. Canada has a very deep and troublesome history with enslavement. And it also demonstrates the way that enslavement was working among indigenous nations that practiced slavery very differently than settler societies, but nevertheless there were sort of versions of unfreedom that were sort of constant in these groups. And Jess, if you want to move just to slide 4, please. And the last thing that we'll talk about is the importance of diplomacy. And I think it's worth noting here that the council to settle this matter was held at the Bay of Quinte. The indigenous nation there was not called to York, which is now Toronto, or to Montreal to solve this problem. The administrators went to the Bay of Quinte, which demonstrates the fact that administrators still had to travel to attempt to influence these groups. They were not powerful enough that they drew groups to them.
But they did have power to, overturn basically how their government worked, because part of the conflict here is that Chief John is the leader installed by the colonial government, and when you read it, it looks like Chief Isaac was given it through the traditional way of installing someone as a chief. And the colonial governments have not learned from this over 200 years, because Cayuga, they still have issues today with traditional government versus United States backed government, and there being conflict between that.
Yes, absolutely. And this is also the case on the west coast of Canada, the Wet'suwet'en protest, which is a massive issue in Canada, is also an example of what happens when you have a state-sponsored leadership structure that runs into conflict with the traditional leaders. And for the Wet'suwet'en in what is now British Columbia, it's all about natural resources and protecting their territory to development. And some government appointed leaders sign off on deals that traditional leaders do not. And so you can again have this internal conflict among these nations. So this is a historic problem, but it remains very contemporary. And I think, when we think about the council and indications of indigenous power and settler learning, um, so this event is part of, as I said, this 200-page collection of council meetings that are kind of like this. And the themes that run through these council meetings are striking. Not only is it usually settler administrators traveling to indigenous homelands, but they are also performing diplomacy as dictated by indigenous demands. So there are ceremonies that are always performed before any business is done. Gifts are given. There are ceremonies of welcome. There are also ceremonies to prepare for discussion. So they have to do things like and they will say this, a settler governor or administrator will say, I'm here to open, I'd like to open your eyes. I want to open your ears. I want to clear your heart. Um, Settlers refer to their leaders in sort of indigenous terms. So the president is often referred to as the Grand Chief. The king was also referred to as a Grand Chief. They refer to each other as brothers and as kin. And this is really meaningful because it does hint at the power and importance of indigenous diplomacy and the respect that has to be paid to that diplomacy if it is going to be effective. And here, just to finish our overview of these themes, the end of the council, the focus really isn't on punishment. It is more on an element of restorative justice. And this tends to be the goal of most Indigenous diplomacy. It's not about singling out a person and having that person either be incarcerated or pay a fine. It's usually about one kinship network making things right with another kinship network.
Yeah. Oh, and before I go, just to remind all of our listeners and viewers that they can submit questions through the Q&A function. But I thought it was interesting that in this document you can see the settler colonial agent was making sure that they followed at the end, and that they would not let the council end until Chief John and Chief Isaac, officially shook hands and accepted the agreement between each other. And it does remind me of similar with the ceremonies. So one of the things for Haudenosaunee people, when we ever have any sort of get together. We're supposed to start with the words said before all else, what's known as the Thanksgiving address. And one of the important parts is that, now our minds become as one when we're doing that. And they were making sure that before this ended, that everyone's mind were as one. So I thought, it kind of ties back into all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the really interesting elements of these kinds of negotiations is it does require a certain amount of learning on both sides to allow these councils to function properly. And sometimes misunderstanding is quite important, because the settler government often does want some sort of accountability, and usually individual accountability, whereas indigenous nations often want a broader sort of resolution to a conflict, the purpose of which is not to punish anyone for wrongdoing, but to make right what has been done and to try to prevent it from happening in the future. And so these are three themes that jumped out to us. And I think at least for the work that I'm doing at the Historical Society, the goal here is to use this as an example to build a broader and bigger story about how settlers learned from Indigenous societies, and also when and why they refused to learn. I mean, so much settler work was in marginalizing Indigenous nations, and attempting to sort of wait them out, if not actively work to destroy them. So in this way, I think the past speaks to our present. In North America and in most colonized places of the globe, settler practices have done irreparable damage to our shared world. We have focused on extraction of resources, of economic growth at all costs. This has led to racial and gender inequality. But what this council document and the kinds of work that Irene is doing at the Institute demonstrate is that there always was and still is other paths that remain available. So I hope the project that I work on, and this will be in concert with the Institute of American Indian Studies. I'm going to be teaching a class with one of Irene's colleagues next semester. I hope that it can sort of dovetail with these efforts and to help illuminate a path towards a more equitable, just, and sustainable future. Irene and I can certainly keep talking forever, but if there are any questions, we'd love to hear them and try to give them an answer. But we could also just keep chatting about what else was in the document.
Well, you know what? It struck me when I was first reading it, but didn't remember to write it down earlier. But just talking about restorative justice, I thought this is an interesting contrast between what happened with this council and what happened after the case of ex parte Crow Dog in the U.S. Are you familiar with that case?
No,
Okay, so it's what happened
but I
was.
would love to hear about it.
Yeah, okay, so what happened was this is in the late 1800s. Crow Dog was a Lakota chief who did murder another person. I cannot remember their name, and that's unfortunate. But he, went through traditional Lakota restorative justice process, and the local white settlers heard about this, and they were not satisfied hearing about this process where he had to pay reparations to the family of the person he killed, and they tried to try him again, and it was even brought all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared, well, no, we cannot reconvict Crow Dog, and we cannot execute him because this is not, basically the Congress has declined to have a law that covers this and says that we can do this. So in response, Congress passed the Major Crimes Act of 1887. That's the one that now says that if it's a major crime committed on the reservation, even if it's between two Native Americans, that includes rape, kidnapping, murder, and a few others, it can only be convicted or only be tried investigated and tried by federal authorities. So it's part of the reason why we have the MMIW crisis, because
Right.
yeah. So I just think it's really interesting that, in 1800, the colonial authorities in Canada were like, let's stick with this restorative justice thing. They seem to be working out. And the US government, 80 some odd years later said, no, we don't like this. We're going to completely get rid of it, make it, because it's not good enough for us, and cause all sorts of other problems.
I think that's such an important it's such an important element of understanding the way that these groups tried and often failed to understand each other. There are other examples. I'm trying to think of, well, there are examples, particularly from other things I've looked at the New York Historical Society that have long-lasting implications on land claims. And one in particular is in the Tabor Kempe papers. Um, and it's the papers of a judge who's trying to adjudicate what to do about this is again sort of Haudenosaunee land that has been stolen on the Mohawk River. And he really struggles with the fact that there are no laws on the books. What do you do when squatters show up and take land that hasn't yet been sort of fully integrated into the United States?
Mhm.
And then indigenous nations attempting to pursue legal action against them, and they're consulting with settler lawyers, and um, they're trying to define the land that they claim, when at the same time the concept of ownership is not the same for indigenous and settler societies. Land is, you're sort of a steward of land for the Haudenosaunee, and the whole point is to make sure that it's there for future generations. Whereas settlers are much more exploitative and looking to have land and make money on it and speculate. So the law doesn't necessarily add up in ways that provide any opportunity to provide justice for indigenous nations.
Um, One of my roles that I have here at the Institute is I'm also, well, I say in training to be a traditional Native American storyteller, because I only know a few stories. But one of the stories we like to tell a lot is um, to help the children understand this difference in understanding of land and use of it, is one where beaver races turtle. And, beaver comes while turtle's hibernating and builds their dam across the pond. And turtle wakes up and says, oh, I've been here like 100 years. What are you doing? And beaver's like, well, I made this place better, so it's mine now. And then they have to settle their difference. But it helps the children at very young ages understand that when Europeans came here, you know, part of their concept for being an owner of a land is that you have to make improvements to it rather than just taking care of it. So when they read in their books that, Europeans came here and said, oh, well, it looks like, perfectly untouched nature. It wasn't untouched. People were taking care of it.
Yeah, and I have students read books about fire in North America, and all the different ways that indigenous nations used fire to improve their land,
Mhm.
whether it's to help with hunting, whether it's to ensure that the right kinds of plants grow. But the idea, that the sort of Lockean concept of you need to be improving land to claim ownership to it doesn't seem to apply, even when indigenous nations are able to demonstrate that yes, we did
Mm.
improve our land. We didn't build a factory on it because we weren't trying to build a factory, but we were making sure that both the land served us, but that we served the land.
Mhm.
And I think one interesting moment that happens earlier in the 17th century is when English settlers come over from, often fleeing from the English Civil War. They've all just lost their commons, right? This idea of land that sort of belong to everyone, and you have rights to take things that you need as long as it's not too much. And they're able to see that again in North America with the use of indigenous land, or the way indigenous peoples used land, and had concepts of boundaries, knew where where the sort of division points between different nations were, but there was no, like we see peppered across North America now, no signs that say no trespassing or private property. Again, it was about making amends. If you hunt on someone else's territory, you give some to them, that sort of thing. And I think those are the moments that um, when I see settlers learning from that and understanding it, really help me um, frame this project in a way that I think will then make some of these connections from the past to the present, so that settlers today can rethink the way that we understand how we deal with territory. Oh, there is a question. Um, it's a complex history. How easy is it to find and interpret the archival record at the New York Historical Society? The society's records are very well organized. You have to get used to the handwriting. That's a big challenge. Reading 17th and 18th century handwriting. Um, but what I find really useful, aside from online guides that allow you to do that, is I think the main challenge is what historians call reading against the grain. So understanding that the written record was organized and archived by settlers who had particular views of the world, and so you have to account for their inherent biases to get at what it is they're saying and describing. So I think that's the biggest challenge. But there are also just so many wonderful books at the library that historians have done a lot of this work for us. So I would also encourage people to go down. And also, I think a great example, just very quickly, is the current exhibition that's up about Manhattan, and reading letters from contemporary Indigenous leaders reflecting on the sale of Manhattan. I think there's an interpretive element there that really can walk you through what settlers think happened versus what Indigenous nations think happened. But that's a great question.
And if I may, if you don't have access to the libraries at the Historical Society itself, and you have to go online, you can also try to find some of the stuff from the Yale Indian Papers Project. They've got some of that digitized and online now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the great things with the digitization effort is there's been great advancements of finding Indigenous records that have made accessible and often have also been transcribed, so you don't have to read the handwriting.
This has been a wonderful conversation. And as you said, we could have gone on and on for a bit longer and learn more of this fascinating history. So we're just going to have to read about it in the book. So unfortunately, we have run out of time. I want to thank Jeffers Lennox and Irene Norman for being with us today. And please, for those of you in our audience, sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on Fellows Talks like this one. Finally, the New York Historical Society is currently open Tuesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website. We hope to see you on Central Park West to view the exhibitions Lost New York, New York Before New York, and Women's Work, in addition to our numerous other offerings. Thank you again, and have a great night.